Hey everyone, today we're going to cover literary form and meaning, and this is a super important, super loaded stanza that we're doing today, and we're going to cover a lot, so I want you to bear with me because this recording may be a little bit longer than what you're used to, but everything in it is uber important, I promise you. So let's go ahead and get started. Literary form and meaning, what does that all mean? Well, fiction, fiction is written in a form, it's a literary form, and it has meaning and is organized in a certain way so that you understand the meaning. And if we recall, fiction is made up of and may or may not is made up and may or may not be based on real life events and real people. That's what makes it fiction. Fiction can be written in the following forms: short stories, novels. Now you may even see fiction is poetry, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. In fiction, authors make decisions about the following elements: characters, setting, plot, theme, point of view, dialogue, and purpose. And we've looked at all of these things individually. Now, just because we're not reading fiction doesn't mean that you get to forget these things. You have to remember them because reading is made up of these things. Understanding what you read when you read fiction means that you understand to analyze characters, look at settings, and things like that. And we're going to cover fiction, believe it or not, in a lot more detail, but it's just important right now that you understand that fiction has its own form, its own meaning, and it has its own elements that make it fiction. But there are also other forms of literature out there that we haven't even touched on yet, but that we're going to look at very briefly this week. First thing that we're going to look at is nonfiction. And obviously, nonfiction is going to be the opposite of fiction. So nonfiction is not made up. This is real stuff. It's the real deal, guys and gals. The people, places, and ideas in this genre are all real. It might look like fiction because it may be a narrative, and we're going to talk about this, that tells a story. So it might have characters and it might have a theme and point of view, but it's still nonfiction. You can tell a real story. You can, right? You probably do it all the time. And you can also tell a make-believe story. You do it all the time, I'm sure. So it may look like fiction, but you have to pay close attention to the subtle differences to be able to tell if it's fiction or nonfiction that you're reading. Because this may even look like an essay or an article, which may make it a little bit easier for you to distinguish from fiction. Second thing we're going to look at is a little something called poetry. And poetry, obviously, is going to look totally different than fiction and nonfiction. You'll know this when you see it because it's written in different form. Okay, so fact, poetry can be fiction or nonfiction. And now I have to backpedal a little because I think I just confused you. Now, fiction and nonfiction is made up, not made up. We get this. But if you have a poem in front of you, that poem could be made up or not made up. So poetry can be fiction and nonfiction, which kind of totally throws us off. But what we want to focus on here is the way things look. That's really important right now. So when you see a short story or an essay, you're going to try and determine if it's fiction, nonfiction, if it is a short story, if it's part of a novel. You never know. But a poem is a poem is a poem. Okay? You're going to see a poem and know a poem when you see it because there are things that make a poem stand out, like stanzas. Final thing that we're going to look at is drama. And drama is in a genre all its own for very good reason, because genre is anything written that's meant to be acted out on stage. And when we have something that's meant to be acted out on stage, you're going to get a totally different feel from it. So it's important to understand the elements of drama. And again, we'll cover them a little bit in this session, but cover them a lot more when we do the drama unit. But let's for now take a close look at nonfiction. Nonfiction includes autobiographies, biographies, essays, informative articles, and interviews. Now, each of these things is going to look a certain way, and it's going to have certain characteristics. So when we think about a biography, it's a story of a person's life told by another person. We're not making this up. Somebody actually lived this life. It's told in third-person point of view, he, she, it, them, they, her, because you're talking about the person about which you're writing. Based on factual research and interviews, it identifies strengths and weaknesses, achievements, and failures on the subject. Purposes are to be accurate about the person's life, also to entertain, explain, or inform. So there you have it. Even when you're writing a biography, authors are still making decisions. Cool stuff. Autobiography, it's a story of a person's life told by that person. So it's me telling my life story. You'd all read that, wouldn't you? That'd be a great story. Told in first person point of view, so you use I, we, me, us, my, our. So when you see something written and it's using first person point of view and it's a story that someone is telling about themselves, that's your clue right there. You got to say, oh, autobiography, I got it. Focuses on events and people significant to the author's life, and the purpose for this is to entertain, explain, inform, express opinion, and persuade. Now we also have informative articles, which are nonfiction, and you recognize articles, right? They provide all kinds of facts about a subject. You see them in newspapers, magazines. Feature stories are examples of informative nonfiction. They tell stories on CNN, or I'm sorry, they give you information on CNN, which is a verbal article, we'll call it for now, even though it's not what it is. Other types of informational materials include textbooks, pamphlets, history books, gardening books, how-to books. These are all informing you about facts about a topic or about how to do something. And that's not fake. That's nonfiction. They're telling you the truth. They're not making this up. This is how you do something. These are the facts. These are the people involved. It's all real. Next, we have nonfiction continued, of course, and we have our essays. Yes, essays are nonfiction. The ones that you write from me, the CRs, nonfiction. Essays are a short piece of writing on a single subject, and they're often found in newspapers and magazines. Again, you can find these in newspapers and magazines, and the purpose might be to share an opinion, explain, express personal feelings, try to entertain or persuade, or describe a topic incident that has meaning for the writer. Now think back to fiction. Didn't our author make those same decisions about why he was writing, what his purpose was? Yeah, he was. He just did it in a fiction package as opposed to doing it in a nonfiction package. So some common types of essays are expository, narrative, and persuasive. Expository is very highly structured. You all know the structure. It's the 5-paragraph essay. It has an impersonal style, and it presents or explains information or ideas. Now, you're going to recognize this because it's going to look like a 5-paragraph essay. A narrative is a little different. You're going to have to look closely at it because narrative means to narrate, tell a story. People tell stories that are fiction. We also have stories that are nonfiction, and we call them narratives. So somebody who may have gone through a difficult time in their life may tell a little snippet of their life as a narrative, okay? It expresses the writer's thoughts and feelings. And we have persuasion, which we're going to spend a unit on as well, and that's where authors write to develop their arguments and to convince readers to adopt a point of view or perspective. And finally, in nonfiction, we have interviews. An interview is a conversation in which one person asks questions of another for the purpose of obtaining information. You all know what an interview is, and you know that it's nonfiction. It has to be real, unless you're a little batty or super creative and you interview somebody that's fake. I don't know. Figure that out. Can that happen? I don't know. So let's move on then to poetry. We understand what fiction is. We understand that it has all these awesome elements like character, setting, plot. We understand what nonfiction is, and we understand that that could be an article, or it can be, what else did we say? An interview, a biography, an autobiography. It could also tell a story just like fiction does. Now we're going to look at poetry, and poetry has a totally different look. Totally different, because when you read essays, you understand that they're structured like an essay in like paragraphs. When you read fiction, you understand it might be broken into chapters, right? Because they're telling a story, or it might be a novel, but you understand that the words are written across a page, right? And now poetry is going to be totally different from those things, because with poetry, you have the poem made up of stanzas. So this isn't words just written across a page and going on to the next line. Poems are very specific in their form, and authors poets I should say, are very specific about the form that they use. So they separate their poems, their ideas into stanzas instead of into paragraphs like the other two genres. So those stanzas have specific names. We have a sestet, and this is where we go to our root words. Sestet is a kind of stanza that consists of 6 lines. If you look up the word sestet, you're going to see a common root in there that means 6. So you see here, if you count our lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. as opposed to our quatrain over here, which is 4 lines. Sorry, 4. Quattro. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. There you go, Maria. Quattro. Jeremiah. Quattro. So quatrain, again, a common root, has 4 lines. Now this word gets a little tricky because some of our stanzas even have a rhyme scheme. What's that? Well, we're going to cover it in a lot more detail later on in the second quarter. But you should know now that when you look at poems, you can look at the last line of each, or the last word of each line, and develop a rhyme scheme by giving them letters of the alphabet. So our first line, our first word always gets an A. So day would be A. If the next line, the last word rhymes with it, it also gets an A. If it doesn't, it gets a new letter, it gets a B. But in this case, it does. We have day, lay, way, me. So we actually have A, B. Day, lay, way, me. A, B. Let's look up here. Let's go back to sestet for a second and look at our end rhymes. We have say, hi. So say is A, hi is B. It doesn't rhyme with say. See, whole new word. That gets a C. Obey, it rhymes with say, so it gets another A. And then we have try, which rhymes with high. High was B, so try gets a B. And he rhymes with C, so it gets a C. So it's A, B, C, A, B, C, and that's a rhyme scheme. Now you know. Now down here, I apologize, half of it's cut off. Couplet consists of 2 rhyming lines that have the same meter. Whether or not we find what we are seeking, blah, blah, biologically speaking, because I have no idea what that says, let's cut off. But you'll see that the 2 last words in a couplet rhyme with each other, seeking, speaking. Next, we have a quintain, which is 5 lines. And it may be rhymed or unrhymed and has a typical stress pattern. Listen, stress is the up-down of our voice, with faint, dry sound like steps of passing ghosts. The leaves, frost crisp, break from the trees and fall. That's a quintain, 5 lines, but it looks very different from this sestet, from this quatrain, and that's what we're talking about here, the differences when we look at things and the reasons an author might have chose to do it in a certain stanza. Tercet comprises 3 lines following a same rhyme scheme, AAA or ABA. My mother's maids, when they did sew and spin, they sang sometimes a song of the field mouse, that for because their livelihood was but so thin. Spin, mouse, thin. A, B, A. All right, you're going to get it. We're going to do that some more. You'll be okay, I promise. Poetry continued. Now, what do poems look like? Besides being organized into stanzas, and again, that's a poet decision. They decide how they want to organize their stanzas. A lot of times in one stanza, you have one main idea that an author, that a poet is trying to convey to you before moving on to a new stanza where there's a new idea or description. Just kind of like fiction, right? Just kind of like what we read. An essay, your constructive responses, you organize it a certain way. So do poets. And now they also look different. Lots of poems look different. And again, it's a poet decision. Narrative poetry, for example, tells a story. There's that story again. And whenever something tells a story, you can bet that it's going to have all of those elements of a story. Characters, settings. So even poems have characters, settings, and themes and point of view. These are not new things. We're looking at the same things in different forms of literature, but they're the same things. So let's take a look at our ballad, which is a narrative type of poem. It's called Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Interesting. First of all, we have a death, me, ourselves, mortality. So we have death, me, ourselves, immortality. We only see the me and immortality rhyming there, so we see a rhyme scheme, but this tells a story. She's telling the story, even though it's fiction, it's made up, right? She's telling a story through poetry. It's a ballad. And then we have free verse, Fog by Carl Sandburg. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. What don't you see there? You don't see rhyme. And that's okay. Some poems aren't going to rhyme. That's the beauty of it. And then we have our limerick. Limericks are fun. Imagine a skunk who proposes to his true love surrounded by roses. It may turn out just fine when she falls for his line, but I wonder if flowers have noses. Cute. It's meant to be sing-songy and fun. So, when we think of poetry, we have to consider literary elements and literary devices. Literary elements are necessary in a literary piece. especially if it's going to tell a story. You have to have plot, setting, narrative structure, characters, mood, theme, moral, all those things. Remember, those are elements. They're necessary. But then we have literary devices, and they may or may not be used. This is kind of like a stylistic technique, and we've talked about that. It's an author's choice. Authors make decisions. Sorry about that, gang. And add another level to the literary piece. So we have something written. It's fabulous. The author did a great job, but he says, I can do better. So he adds literary devices, and it's a stylistic technique. Let's go ahead and see what that means. Figurative language is language that means more than what it says on the surface. So we have literal language. It is what it is. But then when an author wants more, and this is usually in poetry, he's going to throw in some figurative language. If you don't understand figurative language, you're really not going to understand poetry, because the language used in poetry means more than what it says on the surface. Basically, poems give us feelings. So I know a lot of you out there are going, feelings, I hate feelings, I don't want to read anything that brings up feelings. But these are different kinds of feelings. These are feelings where you think about happy things. You relate to sad things maybe through a poem. But it's okay. It's okay to bring feelings to the surface, and that's what poems help us to do. Figurative language is not intended to be interpreted in a literal sense. Literal means you take it word for word. That's not what figurative language is. It's the exact opposite, and poetry is huge with figurative language. For example, one poet writes about the song of the truck. She does not mean that a truck can actually sing. Rather, she is speaking figuratively. She is referring to road noises as music. By using the word song and suggesting music, she brings joyful feelings to the mind. Interesting. So we see figurative language just gives us a new way of looking at the world by appealing to our imagination, by comparing the noises of the road to a song. It often makes a comparison between different things, like the noises of a road and a truck going over it, to a song. And this way it makes those things more interesting, because we would never have thought about them that way otherwise. Poets use figurative language almost as frequently as literal language. And when you read poetry, you must be conscious of the difference between literal and figurative language. Otherwise, a poem may not make any sense at all. So you have to know that when an author says he was an angry bull, he didn't turn into a bull. He was just angry like one. So that brings us to our actual types of figurative language. Onomatopoeia, personification, metaphor, simile, idiom, hyperbole, imagery, and symbolism. Now, we're going to cover these a lot more in the poetry unit, so I just want to touch on them right now. And I want you to pay attention to these, because you will never understand poetry if you don't. So the first thing we're going to look at is words like buzz, meow, vroom, hiss, flutter, shush, ow, yikes, hiccup, clatter, gurgle, whack, fizz, slash, pop, ugh, itch, oink, snort, purr, roar. All of these words sound like exactly what they are. So a buzz sounds like a buzz. So it was named a buzz. But if you hear a buzz, it sounds like buzz. A clap. It's called a clap because that's what it sounds like. All right. Meow. A cat's meow most often sounds like a meow, except my mother's cat, who can't get the meow. She just says, oh. We don't know why. Ding, achoo. And achoo, a sneeze sounds like an achoo sometimes. And boom, of course, a boom sounds like a boom. So this is onomatopoeia, folks. That's a word that sounds just like what it is. Now we have caps and hyperbole. This situation is at least a million billion times worse than I imagined. Caps and hyperbole likes to take things to the extreme all the time. He exaggerates like crazy, and that's what a hyperbole is. It's when you say things that are exaggerations, like, oh my God, I've been waiting for my fries like forever. Exaggeration. Hyperbole. Then we have our beautifully written metaphor. The moon gazed on my midnight labors, while with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness I pursued nature to her hiding places. And I'm lying to you, that's actually personification. Personification is when we give characteristics, human characteristics, to things that can't possibly do that human thing. So the moon gazed. A moon can't gaze. Gazing is something you do with your eyes as a human being. On my midnight labors, while with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness, I pursued nature to her hiding places. Nature can't hide. That's something a human does. But poets make that comparison so that you can imagine what it would be like for nature to hide, or a moon to gaze, or to stare. Next we have imagery, the art of painting images using words, not paintbrushes. I love that, and a little kid actually wrote that. The dark, mysterious sea, pulled by the moon, pours into the arms of Rainbow Bay. Isn't that beautiful? So the dark, mysterious sea, it wasn't just the ocean. Pulled by the moon, pours into the arms of Rainbow Bay. They could have just said the sea flows into the bay. They could have said that. But this is a picture with words. You can picture it in your head, and that's what imagery is all about. Poetry is big on imagery. If you see something with imagery and you're still not sure if it's poetry, it probably is. Next we have, the greater part of the untested men appeared quiet and absorbed. They were going to look at the war, the red animal, the blood-swollen god. That, my friends, is a metaphor. The red animal, the blood-swollen god. That's a metaphor. It is not an actual thing. It's just a comparison to other things. Then we have idioms, and idioms are those phrases we use every day that don't really have any meaning, but we understand them to mean what they're supposed to mean because they've been used so many times. Things like drag their heels, play hardball with someone, he raised the ante, he's as sly as a fox, cut in corners. What does that mean? Nobody really knows because the words all together don't really make sense, but we've used them so often to mean one particular thing, like dragging your heels means that you're procrastinating. We've used them that way so often that they've become idioms. They've just been over time accepted to mean what they mean. Next we have our symbolism. When things stand for something else, even though they are what they are. A dove is a dove. A dove is a dove, of course, of course. A dove is a dove. It's a white bird. But it stands for so much more. It stands for peace. It stands for love. A tree has roots. So a tree is a tree. It's an actual thing you can touch, but it also has roots. Okay? So it's symbolic of, say, a family or a strong person. An eagle, of course, is symbolic of freedom. Our flag is symbolic of freedom. They are things you can touch. They are physical, actual things, but they stand for so much more. A red rose for love, and wedding rings for eternity. All right, and finally we have sharks. Eyes like diamonds, cold as ice, teeth like razors, searching for a victim. I hate sharks. They terrify me. But that, my friends, is a simile. And we notice like or as. It's a comparison of two things using like or as. So what are his eyes like? They're like diamonds. Cold as what? Cold as ice. And that's a simile. Next, we have drama, and we are almost done, so hang in there. Elements of drama by which dramatic works can be analyzed and evaluated can be categorized into three major areas. So now we're looking at plays. You recognize a play when you see it because there's people talking. So in one column, it says the name and then what they said, and then the next name of the character and then what they said. So you know drama when you see it. And there are three major areas of drama that we need to think about: technical elements, literary elements, and performance elements. First are technical elements, and these are the things that we don't really need to know too much about in English class. It's scenery, costumes, props, and all those things that get a play going. What we're more concerned with are the literary elements, and these are going to look familiar to you. Drama is anything meant to be acted out on a stage, and drama has the same elements of stories. All right, because it is a story being told on stage. So the same things we looked at in fiction, the same things we're going to look at in nonfiction narratives, same thing we look at in poetry that tells a story, narrative poetry, we look at in drama. We look at the story elements because it's meant to be acted out on stage and tell a story. So it's going to have all the same elements of a story: character, conflict, theme, plot. The things that stands out, though, in drama are soliloquy, and monologue, which are specific types of dialogue. You see that, remember, in fiction, we looked at those things in stories where two people are engaging in conversation. They do this differently on stage. You have a soliloquy, which is an actor alone on stage speaking, giving a speech. And you have monologue, which is a really long speech made by one actor. And it's delivered, it could be delivered alone, or it could be delivered in the presence of others, even though others may seem like they don't hear that actor. So performance elements are the most important thing with drama because Performance elements are what set drama apart from any other story. We get something from seeing something acted out on stage that we don't get from reading it. Acting is a use of face, body, and voice to portray character. So think about it. If you're reading how a character is behaving, you have to picture it in your mind. But an actor can bring that to life on the stage. All right, so let's come down here to our nonverbal expressions down here. Gestures, we get to see them. Actors are really good at this. They give gestures, big arm movements, head movements, shoulder, arm, hand, leg, foot to convey meaning. So we miss that in stories. We have to imagine it in stories. Body alignment and facial expression, that's huge. We miss that with technology. There's a lot of things that go, where you're offended maybe by a text message or an email because you're missing those facial expressions where someone was joking and you might have seen them laugh. Well, it's the same thing with stories that are written. We have to kind of dive in with our imagination and say, I imagine he's not offended by that. But when we see something acted out on stage, when it's drama, when it's a play, we understand because the facial expressions, the gestures go along with the actions. So that's where drama sets itself apart from the other literary forms. Nothing has changed. We read everything with a critical eye in this course, no matter what it looks like, whether it's a poem, whether it's an essay, a nonfiction essay, a narrative essay, or a fiction story or a fiction novel. Doesn't matter what it is, poetry, drama, we read it with a critical eye, and you remember that behind the scenes, somebody created it. Okay, just like The Walking Dead, guys and gals, somebody out there has that crazy mind who is writing these episodes, and this season is crazier than ever. So no matter which literary form you choose, you have to understand that decisions have been made by the author. Sorry, everybody, I'm back, and yes, without my glasses, I just had a little incident that I needed to attend to, so I had to walk away kind of quickly. I apologize for that. So let me just finish up here. Nothing has changed. We read everything with critical eye. How will I support that point? What is my influence, purposes? Authors make decisions, whether they're poets or they're writing nonfiction or they're journalists writing nonfiction or they're authors writing fiction. They all make decisions, and none of those decisions change. So be sure that you continue to read everything with a critical eye. Remember, there's a whole lot of figurative language and imagery and things like that in poetry, as opposed to our nonfiction, which is more about providing you with the facts. So that's it. You know what comes next. Having a little trouble here with this recording is what's happening because we talked about poetry today and we did a little bit of drama like Shakespeare. Checketh thyself before thee wrecketh thyself, which I think is hysterical. I hope you all get it. Go take your quiz. I'll see you in class.